Hey folks, Assalamu alaikum, Waqaus here. Now I have a question for all of the parents and teachers watching this video. We live in one of three worlds. A world that we can see around us, a world that hasn't even been born yet, or a world that no longer exists. Now the question I ask you, which is the one I often ask myself as a parent and educator, which one of these three worlds are we nurturing and preparing our children and students for? Is it that world that no longer exists? Or is it that world which has yet to emerge? Now there is one thing that we can agree upon, and that is the world around us is changing at a very, very fast pace. And there is a common view that you and I, we can't really do much about that. I question that. What if there are certain things within our control that we are able to influence, which might help us and our children prepare for what the future brings? For example, the influence on the curriculum, emotionally intelligent tools, parenting leadership styles, teaching and delivery, a growth mindset, to mention a few. Now, more than ever before, is the right time to rethink what we teach and feed our children and how we nurture them, so that inshallah in tomorrow's world, they don't just barely survive as ordinary citizens, but rather, and inshallah bi'idhnillah, they thrive as change makers who are able to shape the world and communities around them. If you like what I'm saying and you're interested to join the conversation, I invite you to join me and the Ilm to Amal team in this fantastic 7-part Tarbiyyah series for adults. Here we will unpack and address the burning issues facing the youth, parents and educators, as well as seeking to tease out the opportunities and address the challenges. In this opening webinar, I look at the impact that the recent events have had on the lives and the well-being of young people, as well as their parents and their teachers, and consider what more could we, the adults, be doing to help young people develop holistically and prepare for whatever the future brings. Inshallah, watch this video as I set the scene for the series and paint a picture of the world that we're stepping into and the impact it should have in the way parents and educators approach Tarbiyyah and education. Please don't forget to like and subscribe the channel. We would love to hear from you, so do leave your comments in the section below and ring the bell notification so you could be the first to know about any future events and developments. Until the next webinar, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to all of our participants, wherever you're joining us from. Please do let me know in the chat section which part of the world you're joining us from. Okay, so let me dive into the topic. Rethinking education and Tarbiyyah for a changing world, opportunities and challenges for parents and educators. I'm your host, Waqaus Ali. I head up the organization Knowledge to Action, which is bringing this webinar series to you. It's better known as Ilm to Amal. You're joining me in the first session of a 7-part webinar series. I will be your host. The title of the series will be, the title of the series is the role of parents and educators in nurturing world changes in a changing world. And the series is being brought to you in partnership with Islamic Relief. For those of you who do not know what Knowledge to Action or Ilm to Amal does, then we're an educational charity that specializes in character development and life skills education. We do lots of cool things, as you can see from the screen, namely 3. Firstly, we prepare resources. We have our own character development curriculum, which is being delivered in schools and madrasahs and maktabs. We also prepare storybooks and activity books for parents to facilitate character building at home with their children. Number 2, we offer teacher training days and parent coaching days, as well as retreats for parents, which helps them develop creativity and bring learning to life. Last but not least, which is the important part of the organization, or the heart of the organization, and that is the experiential learning opportunities, or the events that we do, such as residentials, retreats, social action initiatives, which bolster the learning inside the classroom, but allow children to develop skills and build their character through experiential learning. Now, you can check out what we do on our social media using the handle @Ilmamal. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel to get hold of these webinar series on demand. So if you miss this, or you have to leave for recordings, subscribe to our YouTube channel, inshallah, and our social media. You can check out our free resources as well as our paid resources on i2astore.com. All proceeds, inshallah, will help fund the charity and the projects that we do, especially for the disadvantaged communities. Now let's dive straight into it. I did say it's a 7-part webinar series. There are actually 6 modules. Let me unpack what those are. So we're starting here with the first webinar. This is titled Rethinking Education and Tarbiyyah for a Changing World. As I said, we'll be looking at the what and how of education that perhaps needs to change. Now, there are 6 modules that we're going to focus on, and I'll tell you why in a minute. These are spiritual and moral development. So we're addressing the identity crisis that young people are facing and asking the question, whose responsibility is it? Now, there's another module which is titled Mental Health and Wellbeing, looking at stress and anxiety in children. Emotional intelligence and leadership are very much suited for parents and educators, because a lot of findings that we see or hear from young people in particular is that there is a big need for widening the understanding of adults, grown-ups, in how they approach education and parenting. So we're going to be looking at personality types. Do you know yourself and your child, as well as your parental leadership styles, as in your teaching styles, and what works best for your child. Number 6, we'll look at a critical question, a critical debate around schools and madrasahs, or maktabs, you might call them if you're down south, and whether, well, not whether they are, but how effectively are they preparing children for tomorrow's world? And the social cultural development, i.e. what extracurricular clubs could be used to help our children develop skills, important life skills before adulthood. That's the snapshot of what this webinar series contains, and we'll be walking through over the next 6 sessions, 7 sessions, including this one, and which is about 2.5 weeks in this Ramadan 2022. Now, where did all of this come from, and why are we doing it like this? Ilmamal has been conducting a national research study actually for about 12 years, since our inception in 2009. And because of COVID, things came to a halt. We did lots of other things which gave us exposure to children, young people, more than it did before COVID. Obviously, we got to reach more communities and more nationalities through COVID being online. But once the lockdown restrictions had eased off, we resumed our research particularly with Muslim teenagers, because that's an area which is often neglected or hard to understand, and they're somewhere lost in this black hole of society. The research also extends out to the experience of parents and educators. So what we've done is we have interviewed and surveyed, as well as conducted focus groups with about 1,000 Muslim teenagers and about 1,000 Muslim parents. And the teacher one is ongoing at the moment. And this research study is not conclusive, it's still ongoing. I think it's going to be going on for a few more years. But certainly we've got interim findings which are backed up by reports and other studies. And so I'll be using those findings or statistics, citing them as we go along in this webinar, as well as the series, inshallah. And so what you're seeing in the previous slide are the main areas that are coming out of this research as topics of interest, or really important, the part of the solution well, part of the problem or the part of the solution. We need to really address these conversations. So everything that's been designed in this series has come about because of the action-based research that's taking place with teenagers and their parents and teachers. So we feel it's really, really important that these topics now not only need an interactive conversation, a deep dive, but also practical tips and practical solutions. And if you know Ilm to Amal, then we're going to try our very, very best to move from giving you information towards transformation, and in particular, giving you practical tips and strategies for you to go and implement and experiment on all the young people that you know. So it's an interactive conversation. The first one, maybe not so much, but certainly ones in the future, the ones that we're going to be bringing in the series, because I will be inviting lots of guest speakers to come and join me, experts in that field. I'll be the host and having a conversation with them. And what's really, really important and central in these webinars is you, the crowd, the audience, because we want you to interact with us. And for that, I would love for you to post your comments in the chat section and questions in the Q&A bank. Please don't mix them up, otherwise they're going to get lost. Keep the questions concise as possible and relevant to the topic. And please, please do feel like you can raise your hand, and if you want to speak, we'd love to hear your voice. Now, looking at the chat section, what do we have? Wow, we have over 100 plus people joining in on Zoom, and we have probably double that, 200 if I'm not wrong, on Eventbrite on the live stream. So over 300 people have registered for this opening webinar, mashallah, on the first day of Ramadan. So well done, and looking forward to, inshallah, get into it. So let's get into it, inshallah, without further ado. So in this first session, I'm going to talk a little bit about, and you can stop me by all means, please just, raise your hand or ask a question. I can see, mashallah, people are joining in from all parts of the world. Wow, we've got people from UAE, we have people from America, we have people from Australia, we have people, just a minute, hold on, that's like 3 different time zones. We have people all parts of UK, mashallah. We have people from the south, London, Birmingham, Yorkshire, Lancashire, all across the UK, mashallah. We have different towns and cities covered. And we have people from South Africa joining us. Hey, mashallah, fantastic. So yeah, wow, this is really a global event. It turned out to be a global event, and it should be. Webinar number one, Rethinking Education and Tarbiyyah for a Changing World. So what am I going to talk about in this particular session? 6 things I'm going to talk about. Firstly, let's look at the world, what's changing in the world, and in particular, let's look at the pandemic, because that was one of the biggest things, not the only thing, but the biggest driver of change that we've seen in recent years, and it's affected billions of people, countries, and continents around the world. That will have a massive impact on children and, of course, adults. Let's look at what that looks like. And this is a conversation that's been going on and needs to carry on, because what are the problems with the current education system, and is it fit for purpose for our children today and developing them for tomorrow's world? So that will bring us on to the future of education. Now, I do want to get onto 5 and 6 as quick as possible, which is what? Ultimately, I do think being in the field of education as an independent organization, working with children as well as adults, I see the issues on a daily basis, and many commentators, many critical friends of the education sector, as well as educators themselves, will tell you that we really do need to ask this question. We do think that now, more than ever before, is the right time to rethink what we need to teach and feed our children, also how we teach and nurture them. And this is not just for teachers, but it's also for the way we parent our children, inshallah ta'ala. So that's a synopsis of what we're going to cover. It is a very scary, but I'm going to come on to that in a minute, inshallah ta'ala. Now, before I do that, here's a teaser for you. What comes to mind when you see this word on your screen? So when you see this word Tarbiyyah, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Let me know in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. I'm just going to adjust my headphones because they're crushing my ears and I'm not going to be able to hear anything anytime soon. Okay, so we have nurturing, religious nurturing, upbringing,
child development, child psychology. We have cultivation. Yes, the root word Tarbiyyah is the analogy of a farmer, and cultivating from the root word of rububiyyah. So that's a good one. Character building, religious nurturing. We have children's education. Okay, so that's it. Let me ask you a question here now. When we see this word Tarbiyyah, immediately we think of children, and we think of what we need to do to children, or what children need. That's fine. Tarbiyyah usually is around children. But my question to you is, when did the Tarbiyyah, or let me put another way to you, when did we take adults out of the equation of Tarbiyyah? Parents and teachers, when did we get exempt from Tarbiyyah? When did our Tarbiyyah become secondary to the Tarbiyyah of our children? And this is the problem. And I'm going to the heart of the problem very early on in this webinar and setting the scene here, that the Tarbiyyah of the adult precedes the Tarbiyyah of children. The Tarbiyyah of the adult, the parent, the mom, the dad, the teacher, the youth worker, the imam, is the most important part of the equation, because without your Tarbiyyah, what are you going to teach and what are you going to model to your subjects or your children or your students? And your Tarbiyyah is paramount to the Tarbiyyah of your children and your subjects. So we should not neglect our own personal and professional, continuous professional development or personal development, right? It's integral, and that's why this series is important, and many programs that are designed for adults. It's really important that, you know, parents and teachers go back and rethink, look at themselves in the mirror, and not be afraid to challenge themselves. Because if you really want Islah, reformation, and if you really want to improve, then we must not be afraid to look at ourselves in the mirror. That's what the Prophet ﷺ taught us, that we are mirrors to one another, because we help each other learn, reflect, and grow. So we must not be afraid. And if you want to develop, and we want to grow, and we want to be in touch with the reality, we have to have the courage to look at ourselves in the mirror and not be afraid to challenge ourselves. That's an amazing thing to ponder over. And so that brings me, let's get into the topic on what is changing and what is driving change around the world. We'll come on to the pandemic shortly, but let's look at the other things. Globalization, technological changes, politics, Brexit, the Ukrainian war, the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, right? The knock-on impact it has on economical changes, the global economy. Look at, I mentioned globalization, technological. These are two huge things that we're fully aware of, the kind of world that we're living in, and a global village that we live in, and all the use of new technology that's coming. We're moving into the metaverse, which is now basically Web3. It's going to be an immersive experience where we're going to be actually in the internet. We're going to be in this virtual world. The intellectual changes that are happening, I mean, loss of learning that's happened because of COVID or mislearning, the critical conversation around schools. Are we really intellectually developing our children with knowledge that is relevant, is contextualized, is beneficial, or is future-proof? I.e., is it needed for is there creativity, critical thinking for the jobs for the future? Physical, mental, emotional health. Now, this was a major problem or a rising problem before COVID. After COVID and during the pandemic, it really has become a real big issue for many parents, many young people, and many educators, and we'll come on to that. And let's not forget now that because of globalization, we're living in a global world, and there is cultural diversity. Let's look at our social norms and how identity is changed around that. So there's lots and lots of factors that are driving the conversation here around the change, what's changing or what has changed. And as we go on into this webinar and look at what the future of education is, we're going to tease out what needs to change. On COVID now, where do I start here? There's There's a lecture done by Bridget Long, who's the Dean of the Harvard School of Graduates, the Harvard Graduate School. She's done a really good lecture on this, which she looks at the disruptions and the opportunities. What she's saying is that there are as many positives as there are negatives around COVID. But let's look at the impact of COVID on both children and adults. I've put them into these 4 parts. Of course, it's a bit broader than that. And let's be frank, data is still being gathered about measuring the impact of COVID. So we have short impact, and then we're going to have long-term impact in COVID, which hasn't been gathered yet. Now, intellectually, there was loss of learning and virtual dropouts. So there's 2 things here. There are people who have the devices and logged on, and there are those who didn't even log in. They didn't have the devices, or they had the devices and they didn't log in. So there's missed learning and there's loss of learning. And what loss of learning is that so 1 in 5 didn't even log in to the systems. And 4 out of the 5 that did log in, it's not necessarily the case that they had an excellent experience in terms of learning, remotely. Some did and some didn't. Others fell by the wayside. So what's really important here is that we look at what's happened in terms of the intellectual development is that there's been a massive gap and loss of learning. And some research has been shown in America that when it comes to mathematics, up to 4 months have been lost. And when it comes to literacy, up to 12 months have been lost. And obviously the real impact, or the real value of this loss is a lot more than the actual physical days. There were lots of and we know from research, particularly from Department of Education and children's charities on mental health, that the loss of learning for groups that were disadvantaged, so they were the hardest hit, is a lot higher than it has been for people of affluent backgrounds and higher privileges. So higher, there's a loss of learning which is higher for disadvantaged groups. And that gap, which a lot of hard work had been done up to the point where pandemic started, was closing, has now started to widen again. So a lot of work has been undone, a lot of good work has been undone, unfortunately. Now, one of the things that really Bridget Long touches upon is that she looks at, she calls the COVID thing that it's the biggest disruption in the history of education, and that's true. But at the same time, it's also one of the biggest interventions in education. In other words, it allowed us to rethink and recalibrate and renew the way we approach education. So there were some positives from that. Let's look at the statistics. Nearly close to 2 billion people were affected in over 190 countries in every continent. So this was the biggest disruption and the biggest intervention. And it had a massive impact in the way on our intellectual development and learning. Okay. Also, the mental and emotional health, which is a really, really big issue right now, more than ever before. 8 out of 10 parents are saying that their children have anxiety, stress, and poor health. And many have been triggered by trauma, the loss of life within the family or the neighborhood or the social circles. And there's strong calls, lots of calls now for counseling and therapy inside of schools as well as outside of schools. And, it's being considered as like part of essential teacher training. And that has a knock-on effect. Your mental, emotional health has a knock-on effect on your character and your behavior. And now we're seeing, and I've seen this and heard this from personal anecdotes from friends in schools, that there's a rise in exclusions and crime levels for both boys and girls inside of schools. So gang crime, knife crime, drugs abuse, substance abuse, all of these things are now starting to increase a lot more since the pandemic. And we're not over the pandemic, but since the pandemic began. And the research that we're doing looks at that or touches upon that. We're also seeing the influence that social media is having a lot more now, because a lot of these young people were at home, they were bored. What were they doing? They were going onto the devices and TikTok and Instagram and looking at pranks and lots of things which are humorous and perhaps childish or immature, or not suitable for the school yard. These things were influencing their behavior and their ideas. And moving on, we know the physical and social impact, where humans have a need for connections with each other and relationships, but they were massively impacted because of the restrictions. And as soon as those restrictions were lifted, we could see that there was a rise in physical exercise and activities and outdoor adventures and outdoor activities where people normally wouldn't have done that. So that's a good thing that's come about, but it's taken a big event like COVID for us to understand that. And of course, let's not forget the creativity, the style of teaching, teachers having to, be more creative in active learning whilst they were online. Understanding that no two children are the same and no two schools are the same. One size doesn't fit all. There were lots and lots of benefits and lots of negatives, just as same that we're not going to be able to do justice in this webinar, but certainly to understand that there was a massive impact on intellectual, mental, emotional, behavioral, and physical and social, to name a few. Now, what impact does that have on educators? And let's not forget, it wasn't just children here or parents, but teachers too. Lots of resignations happening in the education sector, and lots of teachers just burnt out. The system as a whole is, it was sort of having a hemorrhage before the pandemic began. So the way to sum up the education system, I think, is this fantastic lecture delivered by the late Sir Ken Robinson in 2008. And yes, I do know that is something like, how many years? 14 years ago. Yes, I do know that. Sir Ken Robinson has passed away, unfortunately, in 2020 due to cancer. But this topic that he delivered, and the lecture is available on YouTube, Changing Education Paradigms. And it is such a fascinating lecture, and I just want to tease out one or two key points that he makes in there and move on to what the future of education looks like and what we need to do differently. Here he looks at, so he zooms into this area over here. Now what Sir Ken Robinson is saying here, and he sums this up really well in terms of what's wrong with the education system and whether it is preparing our children for future. What he says here is that the Industrial Revolution happened in the 18th century and the late 1700s. And we saw us moving from farming and agricultural, work towards the steam engines, and then towards the factories, and then towards the internet. So we're in the fourth stage, or the fourth phase of this Industrial Revolution, which is the internet. The first one was the steam engines, and then the factories. So even though the world has moved on and industries have evolved and developed and we've become sophisticated with technology, schooling, which was set up in the first part of the Industrial Revolution, or very, very early on, many centuries ago, schooling was set up. Everything else has moved on from that same time, except schools, as one example here. Schools still resemble the old factories and the mills that we used to have in this country and across the world when we moved from farming towards mills. Take a look at this picture that he paints in his lecture, where it just looks gloomy. We have separate buildings for separate subjects. So you've got science and maths going on there. Education is modeled on the interests of the economy. So there's industrialization taking place. In other words, basically we're designing our education, we're preparing them to become laborers and workers. This bit over here, I found there's a separate facilities, there's a bell that rings, everything's like on a conveyor belt. And if you just look down here on the conveyor belt, we see children coming out in batches, asking, why do we do that? And we still educate them in batches, just like we do with our products on the factory line. And he's asking that I believe we need to go, if you are interested in the model of education, you don't start from production line mentality. In other words, conformity and standardization is, you know, the worst thing that you could have if you really want to nurture creativity in children. And so he's asking that, is this the most important thing, or is this out of date? So everything else has evolved from the first revolution of the Industrial Revolution, but you know, the world around us resembles that. However, our schools and institutes that prepare our children, we send our children to hours and hours a day, still resemble the factories of the first revolution. And that's, in a nutshell, the point he's making about problems with the curriculum, problems with the teaching style, problems just with the ethos of particular schools. And I'm not knocking the schools, guys. I'm not saying that we should close all the schools down. I'm just saying that we need to understand what's wrong with the system and what impact is having, change is having in recent years on that system that was hemorrhaged beforehand. So now the research, I did say I will bring some research into this that I'm doing with Muslim teenagers. Have a look at this very quickly. There is a clear identity crisis going on inside of schools and madrasas from the interim findings that I'm picking up, but you can find other studies to do that. But in my study, or our study that we're doing here, what educators think and what teenagers are thinking just are radically two different things, honestly. 48%, that's half of the teenagers I interviewed, feel both the madrasas and schools just are not preparing them adequately for life. You know, there's just disconnect between what they're learning inside those institutes and what's going on in around the world around them. And they should be talking about those kind of things. Now, I must stress here, this was higher for schools than it was for madrasas. It's just conflated that stat there. Over 70% of teenagers do not receive adequate support from school or madrasa for the mental health and well-being. This is a huge problem. And even many young people said to us that they wouldn't even go to the school teacher or anyone in school with the problem that they had of mental health or suicide or suicidal thoughts or questions around the gender or whatever it is, you know, that's affecting their health and well-being, inequalities or inequities that are going on in their life. They just wouldn't go and approach them. Now, there's a breakdown in trust between the students and teachers, both in schools and madrasas, again, more for school than madrasas. And madrasas, schools don't even really have the capacity for this kind of stuff, although that is changing now because the government, as mentioned, is looking at providing counseling and training, mental health training for initial teacher training. However, there was one positive, which 81% of teenagers did say that they do rely on the madrasa to learn about their Islam or learn about their faith. And many of them actually use, alongside that, 78% actually use the internet and social media to research. So there's challenges there you can see, and there is a crisis around the sense of purpose and belonging of Muslim teenagers in schools and madrasas. Okay. Any questions at this stage? If anybody wants to send a comment. Okay, there's a comment here by Mr. Khalid. This is shocking, what's going on in our schools. More about the research. There will be a report that's going to, as I mentioned, this is interim, it's not conclusive. There will be a report that will address the key issues, the findings, and also the recommendations, inshallah. Not anytime soon yet. Maybe next year, but what we are doing, we will be doing community engagement like this sort to drip feed some of the key findings. As I mentioned, this is not an academic research where we will leave it for 3 years and then come revisit it at the end with the report. It's an action-based research project, which means we find and we simultaneously develop and research the solutions or further research studies alongside that. And that's what we're doing here, that within 6 months, we're having this webinar series, sharing this with you. Now, research into Muslim teenagers, and this is looking at, the previous one was about institutes, this one is about teenagers at home and the crisis that's taking place at home. Now, this is more alarming for me. 1 in 3 teenagers said they don't have a positive relationship with their parents. So now you can see from the previous slide, there's a breakdown in trust between students and teachers, and there's also a breakdown in trust between students and children and parents. So where do they go? 1 in 2 teenagers feel isolated and lonely in their home. That's even worse. Over 70% of teenagers are unlikely to approach their parents for issues affecting them. And these issues ranged from faith crisis to gender orientation or sexuality or mental health, which is a common one, suicidal thoughts, doubts in their faith, lots and lots of different sort of ideas, issues coming out over here. So where do they go? The answer to that, very short, is that, well, obviously, as you've seen before, they go to the internet. They will also turn to the other friends, social circles. So they're more likely to go to their friend at school or down the road than they are to you as parents and teachers. Now, that is very, very scary. I'm a parent of 3 children, and whew, that scares me. I lose sleep looking at that. All right, let's move on. What does the future of education then look like? Well, what could education in the future look like? We know now from what's happened in COVID and the remote learning and long distance working and remote working, that there are a couple of changes that are going to be really important moving forward, especially with the technological advancement and developments that are taking place. I've put 4 main ones here, and again, this was taken from the UN and their paper, which was, I think, the Schools for Future paper, where they were looking at the key skills that need to be developed. So looking at the skills for 21st century work. Now, learning needs to be personalized. That's the #1 thing, that, having standardized curriculum is not working. Learning needs to be personalized, and it needs to be meaningful for students in order to be able to engage with it. So the systems that we have, they really do need to be adapted, and they need to match the learning and support needs of different needs and different backgrounds. We need to meet students where they are, as opposed to expecting them to meet us where we are. This conversation about, well, will humans, excuse me, will humans be replaced and will technology just take over? Well, we've seen in the pandemic that technology on its own isn't effective. If you look at the loss of learning and mislearning that I was talking about earlier, what we do need is we need a combination of humans and technology to work together. As I mentioned, as the main point early on, is that human connectivity, human relationships are really, really important for us, and we need to continue them and make sure that they will always remain, excuse me, they will always remain central and integral for our survival and growth. We can't do IT as standalone. And the health and well-being, of ourselves, whilst we are learning or whilst we're working, it will always remain critical from here onwards, especially with technology. So the future of education, it really is going to be centered around not just IT, but also humans, and learning needs to be personalized. Now, this leads to a question, or 2 questions rather. Excuse me, I can't drink water because I'm fasting. Now, I beg the question that now is more than, now more than ever before is the best time to rethink what we teach and what we nurture our children. So what do Generation Z and the one below them, which is Generation Alpha, which my children belong to, what do they need in order to thrive in tomorrow's world in terms of what we teach them? Well, connected to personalized learning is that education needs to be real life, right? It needs to evolve with their needs and their world at their pace. We need to be focusing on 3 things: giving them a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and a duty of care, or a sense of responsibility to drive the change that they want to see, to be part of their education, or to develop their education and drive that forward, and how that affects the world around them. Number 2, our knowledge-based standardized curriculum has to focus on skills for the future. I mentioned to you earlier, LinkedIn have already cited in their research that 50% of the jobs that exist today will not exist tomorrow when our children come to employability. They'll be gone. And there's so in other ways, looking at it, there's a whole host of 50% plus jobs and skills that haven't even emerged yet. So we need skills for jobs that haven't even emerged yet. So this is why adaptability, emotional intelligence is really, really important. So skills and character are going to be really important. What kind of things we're talking about? Emotional intelligence, as I mentioned, interpersonal skills, global citizenship, creativity, innovation, technical and design skills, resilience, character virtues, empathy, problem solving. This is going to be key for us to develop well-rounded individuals who are able to adapt. In order to do that, we have to teach them differently. We have to, and the question is, do we teach them, or we have to nurture them and develop them differently to the way we have been doing? Problem solving skills, I mentioned, analytical skills are really key for critical thinking and creativity, because creativity is going to be key moving forwards for innovation and development. Now, with IT and the internet and the metaverse, programming, in other words, coding, will actually become a common language. It's already becoming a common language. Lots of young people are becoming millionaires before they even reached high school. I mean, it's just crazy, but it's fascinating at the same time. And this generation, Z and Alpha, they're actually driven by ethics and diversity. Ethics and political literacy and cultural diversity are going to be really important for driving who they work with, what kind of decisions they make, brand loyalty, and who they team up with. We can see that with Black Lives movement. We can see that with their disgust at the politicians who are dodgy, prime ministers who are dodgy, and leaders who are unethical. So ethics and diversity is going to be more and more important. What we got away with in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the last 20 years, that's not going to work moving forwards now, certainly in terms of brand loyalty with this generation. So we do need to start teaching those things inside of our curriculum. We need to be having critical conversations inside of our curriculum and inside of our homes if we are parents. And that is not enough. We need to also rethink how we teach and how we nurture our children. So I question whether we need to teach. We need to facilitate. How can we facilitate learning better? And so we need to focus on facilitation of learning. Teachers need to become facilitators, parents need to become facilitators or friends that they can have conversations with the children with, rather than content deliverers. And the way neuroscience helps us understand the way the brain learns is that it learns through analogy, storytelling, music, experiential learning. Now, experiential learning is that learning needs to be immersive and experiential in the sense that the children need to be involved and hands-on, and then we need to create positive learning experiences. So a lot of practice needs to be, we need to be practicing what we learn. Practice needs to be at the heart of our curriculum. Why? Because practice makes progress. I knew you were going to say practice makes perfect. Okay. Learning needs to be self-directed, as I mentioned earlier, about giving them the tools and putting children into the driving seat. It needs to be self-directed and also bite-sized. Now, Microsoft did a survey, and you've heard this before, that the attention span for humans is less than a goldfish, which is 8 seconds. So now try to understand your curriculum that goes on, for hours and hours and hours, and learning needs to be sort of personalized, and it needs to be self-directed, paced and bite-sized for children and young people, for all of us, in fact, human beings. And so project skills base is really important. I talked about skills earlier, about skills for the, driven for the 21st century workplace. In other words, many people won't be working. What is that anyway? Many people won't be working from an office anymore. So we need to look at the skills that our children will need in order to thrive in the tomorrow society as professionals, as artists, as scientists, as engineers, doctors, musicians, sports people. We need to work backwards with the end in mind, and not have a disconnect. And last but not least, the curriculum. The curriculum needs to be lifelong learning as opposed to hit and run. Hit and run means, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So we need to look at making that as part of the personalized, non-linear way. Now, ultimately, that brings me to a close of what I'm trying to say here, and it sets us up nicely for what this series is going to focus on, that we come back to the central point, that Tarbiyyah starts with you. The 6 focal areas for you, the Murabbi, to introspect are spiritual moral development, mental health and emotional well-being, your intellectual development, personal, social and cultural development, growth mindset, emotional intelligence, and last but not least, personalized leadership. Now, why is this important? This is what you and I need to develop and nurture in our children if they are all, if in order for them to thrive as change makers tomorrow and better facilitate or better manage the change that uncertainties and whatever the future brings. Now, in order to do that to our children, we need to be able to model that to them. So we need to be bringing this in ourselves as much as we want to bring it into our children. And that's why Tarbiyyah starts with you, because the best way to do that is through modeling. Parents and teacher modeling what change looks like, what learning looks like, and how to respond to challenges and what that looks like. So you can see where it all starts with us, and then it trickles down to the subjects, i.e. the child or the students in the classroom. And that's what this series is looking to do. So that Tarbiyyah that we're talking about there has been now packaged into this 7-part Tarbiyyah series in 6 modules that you can see on the screen. And I'm going to be inviting, as I mentioned, key speakers to join me in these conversations. And you also are going to be sending in your conversation, your questions. There are some questions in the Q&A bank. I'm just going to finish these slides and then I will take the questions. Thank you for posting them. Questions around what is emotional intelligence, and how is that different from emotional quotients? There are other questions. There are lots of questions about the recordings and the series and technicalities. We'll address them inshallah once I just get to the end of this slide presentation. Okay, so why don't you tell me what you have taken away as the main points from this webinar series? Tell me what you have taken away in the chat section. We see. Thank you. Tarbiyyah starts with us as adults. Tarbiyyah, my Tarbiyyah is just as important, if not more important, than the Tarbiyyah of my children. Meaning, it's priority. And it's not more important, it's priority. Yours comes before, your Tarbiyyah precedes theirs. We need to continuously develop ourselves professionally and personally. Yep. We can't change the world, but we can change ourselves. Fantastic. That's a really, really good point, mashallah. Thank you for that. And okay, now there's a key point I want to leave you with that I perhaps might not have addressed earlier on, but let me get through it here now. So yeah, Tarbiyyah starts with the adult. It precedes the Tarbiyyah of the child and the student. Brilliant, right? Despite all the changes that are happening, folks, the globalization, the innovation, the use of technology, right? The uncertainties of the political world, or whatever is happening on the economic front. 3 things remain constant, unchanged, and critical for our growth in turbulent and uncertain times. Do you remember what these are? Number 1, humans have basic needs. So physical, social, emotional, spiritual, intellectual, and other needs that we have. So our need for love, our need for human connectivity, our need for relationships, these have been here for a very, very long time, and they remain unchanged, and they will remain integral and critical for our flourishing, our growth, our happiness. So they're not going anywhere. That's the first thing, that despite all of these changes that are happening in the world, this is going to be critical. And if we don't understand that now, during the pandemic, we saw that. If you don't understand that now, 2 years on, then where have we been for the last 2 years when the biggest disruption to education learning occurred? We saw that. Just look at the way our children went back running into schoolyards to meet their friends, and we will look forward to meeting our neighbors, our family members that we couldn't see, or work colleagues. So those needs will remain integral and critical for us moving forwards. Humans thrive when they adopt a growth mindset and are able to adapt to change. So we need emotional intelligence and growth mindset. That's really important. We've seen that people who adapt and people who are flexible are the ones that survive. The ones who don't adapt and the ones who struggle with change are the ones that, you know, really the struggle. Number 3, in all of that, What is really, really important is coming back to this central point about you, the adult, the parent, the teacher, the youth worker. The role of parents and teachers is going to remain integral and critical for the development of our children. And it has remained unchanged for centuries. Parents and adults have always been there. The family unit has been the key madrasa or the key learning point, the environment. And we, despite the globalization, the technological advancement, the robots, the automation industry, and the gadgets that are coming, we've seen during COVID and the pandemic lockdowns that the role of parents and teachers is absolutely critical for the development of our children, especially if we want to develop emotionally intelligent and dynamic children. That can really largely only happen through modeling and experiential learning and relationships. So that's really, really important. And these are the three main points outside of the first one, which is that it all comes back to starting with us as adults before we go to our children and students. And the good news is this: emotionally intelligent tools, the skills that our children need, and what we need to broaden in our curriculum, and what we need in ourselves in order to bring that curriculum to life. So what we teach and how we teach, the emotionally intelligent tools, the growth mindset that we're talking about, these are all things which we can develop. And the best thing is that we can actually foster them, not just in our own homes, as parents, also our schools, madrasahs and maktab, and the extracurricular clubs. With the help of parents and youth workers, we can harness and we can foster these skills and these tools, not just in ourselves, but also in our children. That's the good news. So we can do things. So folks, yes, the world is changing around us at a rapid pace, and there's not much we can do about that. But I often question that, well, actually, is that even true? There are certain things within our control and within that we are able to influence. Of course, there's lots of things outside of our control in our circle of concern, and there's not much we can do about that. But there are lots of things that we can, and these are the things that we can do. We have basic needs. We need to prioritize those: the spiritual, the emotional, the social, the physical, intellectual, and the cultural, not to forget mental. We thrive when we have a growth mindset, or when we are able to adapt, right? When we embrace challenges and we give it a try, we step out of our comfort zone. That's really important for us to move forward. So no is not an option. We can do it, and we must do it. And that's how our brain has been wired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Brain plasticity is we can adjust our mind, we can rewire ourselves. And last but not least, which is the most important part of this series, is that the role of parents and educators is integral, has been integral for centuries, since time began, and it's going to be even more critical. Our needs as humans are going to become even more critical tomorrow with the development of the technology, the use of technology and robots and automation. So there you have it, folks. Our continuous professional and personal development should never be compromised at the expense of others, whether that is your children or your your co-partner, other spouse, or anyone else for that matter. Accessibility or even affordability. Okay, resources, lack of resources, a budget if you're in a school or institute. Never. We should continue to develop and grow. If we are not growing, and if we have stopped our tarbiyyah, just like the plant doesn't grow, if the plant isn't growing or hasn't grown or evolved, then it's dead. So we must not stop, otherwise we'll die, right? Next webinar, inshallah, in this coming Wednesday, I'm really happy to announce that I'm going to be inviting an organization called Here for Youth, which is a project by Islamic Network. I have two guests, Abdurrahman Chachia and Ayub Sidat, who also have been spearheading a research survey or research study into looking at the identity crisis amongst millennials and Generation Z, Gen Zs. And we're going to be having a conversation about whose responsibility is it to address these concerns and these issues that are affecting our youth. Please join us for that webinar. That link is live now on Eventbrite. And from there, I will give you details about the other webinars coming up. Please do get in touch on the contact details on the screen. You can follow our social media, drop us a question for the next sessions. I've got some questions that I will take now and answer, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for following. I hope it's been informative. I tried my best to set the scene and paint a picture of the world that we're stepping into. It's not all doom and gloom. This is a time to roll up our sleeves and take responsibility for our flock. I will leave you with that, inshallah, and see you at the next webinar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.